Hi, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Tonight, Left Bank Books is excited to welcome author and historian Patricia Cleary to discuss her new book, Mound City, the place of the Indigenous Past and Present in St. Louis. Patricia will be in conversation tonight with UMSL Professor Andrew Hurley, so we're excited to have them both with us. Some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of all of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets and parks and more. It also helps writers get the support they deserve and allows us to produce events such as this. So thank you all so much for shopping local and supporting this event. We have a great crowd tonight, so thank you all so much for coming. If I know we're getting pretty tight on seats, if you're able and comfortable to kind of scoot closer to open up some seats at the end for any latecomers, we would appreciate that. So, yeah, we've got one seat up.
Sorry,
well. No, thanks for coming.
I say this to my friend who's parking the car.
All right, and we're also excited to extend a welcome to our virtual audience. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are tonight. You'll be able to participate in the presentation by leaving your comments and questions as a YouTube comment. We'll be able to incorporate them into the Q&A at the end, so thank you. We at Left Bank are always working hard to plan new events for readers of all ages. Of note, July 16th, we'll be having an event with historian Kathleen Shepard, author of Women in the Valley of Kings, the untold story of women Egyptologists in the Gilded Age. Info about this event, as well as a full calendar of all of our events, is available at left-bank.com. And now for tonight's event. Patricia Cleary is Professor of United States History at California State University, Long Beach. She grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and completed her undergrad degree at Rice University in Houston, and her graduate degree at Northwestern University in Illinois. She is the author of two books, for the second of which, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, History of Colonial... Sorry, two before this one. Two previous books. The research that she did for The World, the Flesh, and the Devil turned to the study of the history of her hometown, exploring the diverse and complex social and economic relations among French, Indigenous, Spanish, and African inhabitants. While working on that project, she decided to try and tackle a study of the mounds that predated and once stood on the site of St. Louis, setting the stage for tonight's look. And Dr. Andrew Hurley is a professor of history at UMSL. He is a specialist in the field of urban history with a strong interest in environmental history, public history, and the 20th century United States. Andrew's research in urban environmental transformations lends itself to a variety of digital applications and approaches, including a software package that enabled users at various skill levels to build 3D computer models of historic landscapes. This technology led to his current collaborative research enterprise with National Geospatial Agency and the local Greer Museum of Black History. Patty and Andrew will be in conversation tonight discussing Patty's new book, Mound City, the place of Indigenous Past and Present in St. Louis. This book covers the layers of St. Louis's Indigenous history, along with first in-depth overviews of the life, death, and afterlife of the mounds. Mound City offers a gripping account of how Indigenous histories have shaped St. Louis's growth, landscape, and civic culture. St. Louis Magazine calls this book an enlightening, well-researched history that provides readers with a complete view of the creation, use, loss, and legacy of the mounds. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Cleary and Andrew Hurley.
Well, I think we'll get started. And the way that we'll operate tonight is we'll have a brief conversation. I will prompt Patty with a few questions, and I think after about 20 or 30 minutes, we'll turn it over to the audience. I want to start by saying how delighted I am to be here and to be part of this conversation. Not only because I have known Patty for many years, and it's just been wonderful to be part of the various projects that she's worked on over the years, and be on stage, share the stage with her this evening, but also because this is such a wonderful book, and hope to be part of sharing the work with you, and get you so excited about it that you'll want to rush to the cash register and purchase it.
I will be making almost nothing over the next 20 years in royalties, so just so you know, I did not put Andrew up.
I was thinking often at presentations like this one, the host or the speaker will start with a land acknowledgement, and you have the land acknowledgement in this book, which recognizes this place where we are now is an ancestral home of the Osage Illini Confederation and the Missouri, acknowledging that this is still their home, and that these indigenous peoples have a claim to this land. And I think there's no more powerful underscoring of that than this book. This is your book is a land acknowledgement. And in a way that really deepens what that's what you're trying to convey in those statements. I'd like to start with the title of the book, which is Mound City, and that is not a name that you invented, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about why that's the title?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say thank you to Andrew for being the person who asked me to research the history of St. Louis in the first place. We've known each other since graduate school, and Andrew asked me sometime in the mid-90s if I had ever done any research on colonial St. Louis, and if I would consider doing so for a collection on the environmental history of St. Louis, which he edited, called Common Fields. And it was while doing the research for that piece that I realized there was just a wealth of unmined manuscript material in French and Spanish sitting at the Missouri History Museum, and that I, as a St. Louisan, was largely ignorant of the colonial era of St. Louis history, that I understood Lewis and Clark. I had heard endless stories from my dad, who was a big St. Louis fan, about the gateway to the west and westward expansion and these kind of highlights of St. Louis history. But I really knew very little other than that until I began to do the research prompted by one essay that then turned into the book, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, which I don't know if anyone in here has read it. I probably shouldn't ask. Yeah, the titter says it all. But part of it was about how people behaved really badly. That they were too worldly, too obsessed with things of the flesh, too into gambling and drinking and all sorts of licentious behavior. And it was while doing the research for that book that I came across one reference after another to the mounds, in particular to the Grange de Terre, the earthen barn, the French called it, the big mound, which at its base was the size of a football field, more or less, and 30 feet high. And I was sitting in a conference at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. I think it was 2009, and it was the only time in my life as a scholar that I've ever had this experience. It was a conference about antiquities and how people were obsessed with the ancient past. And if you go to Washington, D.C. today, for example, you don't see a unique Washington, D.C. architecture. You see public buildings modeled on ancient Greece and Rome. And so there was this obsession with antiquity as a kind of marker of legitimacy. And that search for an ancient past continued as white Americans moved westward into this area that was full of mounds. And the mounds, there was a complex of about 27 that stood just to the north of where the arch is today, about roughly 1 mile, like 0.8 mile to about 1.1 mile if you walked north from the arch along Broadway. Those mounds were beyond the colonial village borders. But gradually, over the course of the early 1800s, as the city expanded northward, they were surrounded and repurposed, and clever businessmen in the area started calling every business that they could think of Mound City this or that. So there was Mound City Cured Hams, Mound City Marine Insurance, Mound City Coffee House, Mound Methodist Church. Everything was about the mounds. And so what was initially kind of a neighborhood identifier of businesses located in the vicinity of the mounds in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and on, became later, by the late 1800s, well, mid to late 1800s, a nickname for the city of St. Louis. It was known as the Mound City well beyond the city borders in Europe, on the East Coast. People knew St. Louis as the Mound City, and the mounds were a huge tourist attraction. It's a very long answer to that first question.
And the story of the mounds and actually that term, mound cities, really captures the paradox that's at the heart of the book. On the one hand, while the city is raising the mounds, erasing this indigenous heritage, it's also claiming it as its own. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
So in fact, I see somebody in the audience already has a copy. Can I borrow your copy for a moment? So if you see on the very front cover, the top image is an engraving based on a daguerreotype, a photograph by Thomas Easterly of the big mound before it's destroyed. So I think this image, I think, was from the 1850s. On the bottom, so that's the big mound that a lot of people considered the main reason for the nickname of Mound City. And at the bottom is an image of St. Louis from probably about 1873. I don't know if you can see that. It's just a grid of city streets, Eads Bridge, newly constructed. But what the original lithograph, which is printed elsewhere in the book, has across the sky above the river are the words Mound City. So 4 years after the biggest mound was raised, the lithograph, widely distributed, very popular, is labeling the city Mound City.
So how do you make sense of that?
Well, I think this is my cue to say, read the book. But actually, Andrew has read the book, and I would like to not only thank him for beginning us with a land acknowledgement, but also thank him for his early readership of a full draft of the manuscript, which we were talking about this beforehand. He hasn't actually read this book, but he read this book as it existed about 2 years ago and typed up, I think, 8 single-space pages worth of comments, as did some really amazing scholars who the University of Missouri Press asked to do the same. And the book is much better for all of their efforts. But part of what I think is going on, this sort of central paradox, has to do with how St. Louisans were claiming for themselves the mantle of an indigenous past. And there's an indigenous scholar by the name of Jean O'Brien, and I may explain this concept too briefly to make it fully comprehensible, but she wrote about the idea of firsting and lasting. And she wrote about it with regard to a small town in New England, about how the white settlers in that town talked about, when they wrote town histories, the first indigenous peoples to live upon that site. Those were the ones who had firsted, right? They were the firsting. And in these same local town histories, they described themselves, in a sense, as the logical inheritors of an earlier indigenous past. That there are firsting and lasting, and the two go together. Indigenous people start the settlement, but white Euro-Americans eventually develop it and bring it to its fullest fruition. So the name Mound City simultaneously harkens to that much earlier indigenous past. This complex of mounds on the St. Louis side of the river was built almost 1,000 years ago. 2,000 or 3,000 people lived right here almost 1,000 years ago. But the city is the city of St. Louis, right? And they're connected.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes through, I think, in this book is just how the Europeans that came here just didn't know what to make of these. mounds. And it was not just a kind of intellectual confusion, but it was the difficulty of how to interpret them in a way that aligned with what their city building goals were and what kind of social order they wanted to create here.
Yeah, so if you saw the mounds as they existed, and those of you who have a copy of the book to hand, I don't know what page it's on, but there's an 1819 map that shows the layout of a plaza and the mounds are arranged around it. It's very clear that somebody planned this. This is a carefully designed by architects and engineers complex of structures. They were abandoned for some centuries before Europeans settled along the site, and they would have by that point been covered with brush and trees. Some of them might have looked like small hills, might have looked like natural formations, but they were unmistakably created by people, and the biggest ones strikingly so, right? They weren't pyramids made of stone like those of Egypt or Teotihuacan or the Yucatan, but they were pyramids, some of them nonetheless, or circular, truncated mounds. They were very, very large. When Europeans arrived, they talked about them as antiquities. Some of them wondered where they had came from. You'd say, well, how do you find out about something you don't know? You ask questions, right? And William Clark's brother, George Rogers Clark, asked a local indigenous man, a Kaskaskia chief. He said, what do you know about these mounds? And he was talking about the ones around Cahokia. And he said, well, my ancestors built them. We were numerous. We built them all over the place. And George Rogers Clark, and I go on and on and on about this episode in the book, but George Rogers Clark says there's no reason to discount his knowledge. This tradition is as good as our history. But many, many, many white Americans discounted it, ignored indigenous knowledge sources, and some people went so far as to claim that the mounds were either completely natural, like we know St. Louis sits on limestone bluffs well above the river, right? But nonetheless, in this natural formation model, the river flooded and deposited big piles of dirt perfectly symmetrical around the plaza. So the natural formation theory existed for a long time. There were others who claimed that these mounds were the signs of a superior civilization that had existed long ago, and their own racist understandings or projections about hierarchies of civilizations led them to declare that it couldn't have been the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples, but that maybe it was the Welsh. My husband is half Welsh. His family really likes this story. And somehow or other, the Welsh came from Wales and sailed up the Missouri River, or that it was people from the lost continent of Atlantis, or a lost tribe of Israel. So that's one sort of cockamamie set of theories. And then there are others who say, so indigenous peoples who were in the area in the late 1700s, maybe it was their ancestors, not who had built the mounds. Maybe it was their ancestors who had killed the people who built the mounds. So one way or another, there is a pretty wide-ranging set of theories that discounted the links between contemporary indigenous peoples and those who had built these monumental earthworks.
Yeah, which even persisted well beyond the time when archaeologists and more kind of scientifically driven research established without question that they were human built by people who inhabited these lands. Still attempt to kind of separate the mound builders from the indigenous people who were in part of that early encounter between Europeans and the people of the region.
Yeah, and in fact, that tendency to discount the historic links between indigenous peoples and the mounds is not entirely past tense. Last summer, when I was chasing down some citations, I was trying to figure out what had happened to the various funerary objects, particularly beads, as well as human remains that were interred in the big mound. There were other mounds in the St. Louis area that were burial mounds. Mounds had different purposes and functions, but some of the materials that were taken, grave robbed from the big mound, ended up at the Smithsonian Institution. Some also, there are at least 7 sets of human remains at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is sort of a medical college, big collection of human remains. And I spoke to somebody at the Smithsonian. I said, I'm trying to figure out, what do you have? I can see what you have from your catalog, and I'm trying to get this information. And I know that the Osage Nation has links to the mounds in this area. And the man on the phone, he wasn't the regular curator, he was on vacation, but another curator, he said, what's your proof that the Osage are connected to the mounds in this area? And I said, well, it's not my proof. It's through a very elaborate, lengthy process under NAGPRA legislation, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was signed under the first Bush president. There are procedures for establishing which tribes are affiliated with particular sites and particular sets of remains and funerary objects and so on. And I said that, there's been NAGPRA processes that have established that, and my recollection from having read the material was that it talked about artifacts, oral traditions, linguistic material, all sorts of different things. And he's like, I don't buy it. And I'm like, this is not between you and me. I'm just trying to track the record of what the Smithsonian has and how you're handling this material. But I mention this in part just to not only kind of share my own ignorance in general, but the ignorance of others on the subject. And I'm far from the expert on all things NAGPRA related or indigenous related, right? I started with a series of questions about the mounds. But the point of the Smithsonian example is, I guess, just to address the issue that a lot of these issues are extremely current and pressing. There are huge numbers of human remains of indigenous peoples and sacred objects in museums and libraries and university collections, as well as private hands all over the place.
We're talking a lot about the mounds, and it's a book where the mounds feature prominently, but it would be misleading to create the impression that this book is just about mounds. In fact, the mounds are kind of a stand-in for a larger process that's going on, a colonial process by which Europeans and their descendants attempt to erase indigenous culture from a place, erase it. And it's not entirely a successful endeavor. You want to talk about that?
No, of course it's not. Part of it was based on this myth of the vanishing Indian, right? That there was this falsehood, this assertion that indigenous peoples were destined to vanish, and they would vanish in one of 2 ways. They would simply die out numerically, or they would vanish because they would be entirely assimilated into dominant white American culture and no longer distinctive. And neither of those things happened. But in the 1800s, many white artists, policymakers, presidents, people like Andrew Jackson, really held to that notion very closely. And George Catlin, whose paintings you may be familiar with, who painted many portraits of indigenous people, he saw it as his mission to chronicle and portray in paint native peoples before they had disappeared. They never disappeared, right? There's a great PBS series through the American experience called We Shall Remain. Really worth watching if you haven't seen it. And there were periods, of course, of population decline due to not only epidemic disease, but US wars against Native peoples and forced removal. But the population was never on the verge of disappearing. And there, of course, even though the state of Missouri legally prohibited Native peoples from living here between 1832 and 1909, there are significant numbers of Indigenous peoples here, and there always have been, even though legally prohibited.
So, if I were to try to summarize the book or you capture its essence in a sentence, it's exploring this intention. I don't know if this microphone is coming in and out, isn't it? I'll just talk loud. For those of you in the back, Joe, if you can hear me back there, or if you can shout out.
Yes.
All right. It's about this tension between, on the one hand, efforts of white European populations to erase Indigenous people and its culture from this place, and the persistence and the endurance of Indigenous peoples, their culture and their claim on this place.
Right. And there's actually the National Museum of the American Indian, a branch of the Smithsonian on the Mall, had a great exhibit called Indians Everywhere. And the point of the exhibit was, it started with an assertion. It said, Native peoples represent 1% of the population of the United States. Yet images of, stereotypes of, cultural references to Indigenous peoples are everywhere, whether it's in Boy Scout names and skills, or a Pontiac car, or a Cherokee Jeep, or Big Chief notebooks, or the Land O'Lakes butter covers. The images and the words are everywhere. Tomahawk missiles. The Pentagon in 1969 issued a directive saying that aircraft and missiles should have names that had dignity and kind of aggressiveness, and should be named after Indigenous peoples, have Indigenous names. So there's been this kind of obsession. A great book, we're in a bookstore for anybody who's looking for interesting things to read, is by Philip Deloria, who's an Indigenous scholar who's at Harvard, who wrote a book called Playing Indian. And it's kind of about non-Indigenous Americans' complicated, paradoxical relationship with Native culture and Native people. And in St. Louis itself, we had an amazing example of people playing Indian. There was this big historical mask and pageant in 1914. 5,000 people. Like, you all have been to Art Hill, right? I'm just going to stand up for a second because I can't see people's faces. As a teacher, that bothers me. I worry that people are falling asleep. So, how many of you have sat on Art Hill on one occasion or another? You know what good sight lines you have, right?
Right.
Imagine you're in a crowd of about 70,000 people sitting out on Art Hill on a Memorial Day weekend in 1914, and you're looking down at the water, and there's a gigantic stage, and the water is meant to represent the Mississippi, and there's a cast of 5,000 people reenacting the history of St. Louis, including the history of the mound builders. And do you know who played the mound builders? And who played the Indigenous people? Yes, it was white people. It was not a local Indigenous man who said, I'd like to play a Native person on stage. I have a lot of experience. I kid you not. You know, it sounds comical, but you know, it certainly wasn't. He's a really remarkable character. It's in the book. But what they had was, there's a group called the Improved Order of Red Men, a fraternal society of businessmen. There was a Hiawatha chapter. Who was Hiawatha with? Whoever knows the old poem, Hiawatha and
Nakoma.
Yeah, no, there's someone else too. Anyway, so there are all these chapters, and the fraternal order of the Society of Improved Red Men, they donned, as the Post-Dispatch put it, copper paint, and they played Indian on stage. And they thought it was perfectly reasonable for them to do so. Okay, awesome.
And yet at the same time, what you show in that chapter is this indigenous person was
Louis Menard.
Louis Menard found a way to participate
He did.
in the presentation. And that's what we find over and over again. There are these acts of appropriation and erasure, but the indigenous presence remains.
Right, and what Louis Menard did, he was Menominee. His dad was from Wisconsin. His dad was known as Indian Lou. He was also known as Indian Lou. And his mother was descended from some of the earliest European settlers in St. Louis, and a colonial era bell had traveled down the family line, and he had it, and he played the role of a bell ringer in the scene from the colonial period in the account.
One of the things that's so appealing about this book, in addition to the beautiful prose, are the images. It's like an art book. You must have close to 100 images.
I think about 74.
Oh, that's close to 100. Of paintings, of historic maps. Tell us a little bit about that process of selecting the images, the artwork for the book.
I guess the first thing I wanted to do, because as somebody who did not know about these mounds growing up, I knew, as I think many non-native St. Louisans do, of Cahokia mounds. I did not know of the mounds that were just north of the Arch. I wanted to, well, I think the inclination of all researchers is want to put down everything you ever found, right? In the hopes that it's helpful. But in this case, it seemed to me that the visual record, the visual testimony, both to the presence of the mounds and the ways they were used and repurposed, built upon, excavated for reservoirs, destroyed, was a really important part of the story of how local St. Louisans interacted with them and treated them and ultimately raised them. And I think, and there may be other images out there with which I am unfamiliar, but I think every pre-1900 image of the mounds that exists, I have in the book. So it's just, part of it is I'm just trying to, obviously there's a huge amount of work that can be done on Native people's history in St. Louis. A huge amount, and I barely touched the 20th century, but I wanted the research that I did to be a record and a starting place for others in the future so that that material is there. I mean, some of the things I found no one has ever noted before. I think it was just, well, I won't say it was entirely luck, but like there was actually an effort by the Board of Aldermen in the 1850s to try to preserve the big mound as part of a park. And I only know that because I went through about 3,000 pages of Board of Aldermen handwritten minutes to see if there were any references. And I mean, this is like one paragraph, but it's important, right? That there were short-lived efforts, but ultimately they failed. And there's this failure over and over again when people are not, I guess, I would like to think that historians are interested in preserving the past. Historians have done a pretty good job of erasing Indigenous histories for much of our disciplinary history. But that effort failed, but I think it's worth noting and trying to learn from as we think about our city and our riverfront, about which you've written at length.
We talk about the images. It's more than just pictures of the mounds and maps of the mounds. There's all depictions of Native Americans by white painters and artists, and they're not just illustrations, but there's a lot of visual analysis in the book, and that exemplify the themes the arguments that you make. And one of my favorites is your analysis of that, just the story of the Catlin painting. You mentioned George Catlin.
Oh, right.
That's one of the most powerful, I think, episodes. Share that with you.
Let's see. I'm not sure. Can I look through the book for a second? Can you find that?
Yeah, I can actually,
That
because
image?
I
you
think
have
it's
your
on
own
page
copy.
146.
So, yeah. Anyway, so George Catlin was a painter who, after seeing indigenous people on the streets of Philadelphia, and he hadn't seen any native peoples before that he was aware of, he decided that it was going to be his life's work to record their lives, their culture, their appearance before they disappeared. And so he did what anybody interested in native peoples did in the 1820s and 1830s, which is he hurried to St. Louis, because St. Louis had a reputation as being a center of access to indigenous people and culture, both because of the antiquities, the ancient mounds on its northern border, but also because William Clark had what was known as an Indian museum, his basically diplomatic reading room that was 3,000 square feet. And its walls were covered with artifacts and paintings and objects from indigenous peoples, some acquired through trade on the Lewis and Clark expedition, others no doubt taken and appropriated. Catlin studied the objects on Clark's walls. He studied them very, very carefully, made loads of sketches so that he could use them to paint native peoples. And he painted lots of them. And he painted a man by the name of Black Hawk, who was held prisoner as a prisoner of war at Jefferson Barracks when the Black Hawk War ended. And the Black Hawk War was early 1830s. It was kind of the aftermath of a treaty swindle on the part of William Henry Harrison from 1804. And the Sauk and Fox tribes were living in an area sort of along the river, Illinois, north of here. And they had planted their fields, they had gone hunting, and when they came back from a hunting expedition, and it was getting close to time to harvest their crops, they found their homes full of white people who were there in defiance not only of the Sauk and Fox, but also of US law. And they were there and they made the indigenous people leave at gunpoint, leave their own homes, leave their own fields. And a war followed, and the native peoples lost. Black Hawk ended up in jail at Jefferson Barracks. And while he was there, you won't be able to see this too well. I'll ask somebody in the front row to tell me, what do you see the men in that image here on the left? What do they have? Can you tell what that is?
Can't tell for
Can you tell?
sure.
So Catlin wanted to paint everybody ball and chain. Catlin wanted to paint native peoples with quivers, in buckskin, with feathered headdresses, with tobacco pipes, with beads. In the case of this particular image, the man who's standing to the left of, or to the right of Black Hawk is a man by the name of Neopope. And when Catlin was trying to sketch out his image, Neopope saw it and noticed that the ball and chain weren't in the picture. And he said, I want you to show those. I want you to show the ball and chain. And Catlin was like, no, I don't want to put that in the picture. And Neopope kept on insisting and kept on moving and changing his pose and changing his facial expression until Catlin agreed. That image, which was sketched out in the very early 1830s, Catlin didn't finish it for decades. And I think he was unwilling to finish it because it represented something very different than the idea of the vanishing Indian. This is the native person, the indigenous man, as a political prisoner of war, a man who's defending his home and his homeland from an aggressive, intrusive US government and white settlers who are taking the law into their own hands. And showing him with the ball and chain is recognizing him as a political being of will who's being held captive by an invading state. Anyway, that's not altogether my interpretation, but I think it's a very powerful example of how an Indigenous person is pushing back against the white gaze, the white voice.
And the book is full of wonderful stories like that, very evocative episodes. We've been going on for over half an hour, and we could go on for probably half an hour more, but that would deprive the rest of you of an opportunity. So I'm going to say, wow, there are a lot of people here. Give you folks an opportunity to ask our author some questions. So I'll field questions so that you can have a break between answering them. So the first, I saw a hand back there? Yes? No? Maybe? Joe.
So you touched on this, and since it seems like the topic of your book is going to be separate from the normal discussion of what happened in Cahokia, the collapse, all the kind of some humorous theories that have been out there and written about, how do you choose to interact with those topics from like Pocket to Fritz, while your topic is a little bit more it doesn't seem like it's so much about the archaeological history and the collapse, and it's more about the westernization of the story since then. Or maybe I'm getting that a little wrong, but how do you choose to engage with those old stories in your
Right. So the things that I mentioned to you about the Welsh and Atlantis and the Lost Tribes of Israel, I just mentioned that as an example of how outlandish the theories were that people developed, because there were so many outlandish theories about many different topics. Archaeologists and early archaeology in particular do feature in early chapters of the book, because part of what I'm trying to do is really sketch out from the time the mounds were constructed, and those mound centers, Cahokia, the ones that around Cahokia and around East St. Louis and St. Louis proper, when those were sort of in their heyday, and then trace over the course of a chapter or more, several hundred years of history. And I'm not an archaeologist, but I have tried to read and sift through and synthesize that work to get to the point of really thinking about the late 1700s. And much of the book is about the 1800s and the early 1900s. So that material is in there, along with some criticism that emerged in the 1800s and subsequently of the work of archaeologists and of the naming practices of archaeologists.
Thank you.
Okay.
There were some hands toward the front, very front. Go from the very back to the very front.
I'm just curious what became of William Clark's Indian Museum.
That's a very good question, and it's not clear what happened to it. One theory is that a lot of the artifacts ended up in the hands of a German exhibitor who took them back to Germany, and there's a kind of a strange German fascination with indigenous culture that's been around for a long time. A lot of things probably ended up just in private hands. Some of the material that was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition ended up in Jefferson's own sort of private museum at Monticello. Others of it ended up in Peale's American Museum in Philadelphia. But what was here, I don't know. And there's been, there was a bunch of scholarship about it that's a few decades old now, and basically nobody could figure out exactly what happened to it. Yeah.
Thanks, Patty. So I'm wondering, because I grew up in St. Louis like you, and I don't remember hearing hardly anything about the mounds or Cahokia or anything when I was growing up in the late 60s and 70s, and I'm wondering if this kind of appropriation of, Indigenous identity to be sort of an authentic St. Louisan, right? Wondering is that pretty steady, do you think? And I was just sort of out of the loop, or because it seemed to me that what happened was sort of in the last 25 years, there's been this kind of resurgence of interest in the mounds and in Cahokia, and really all the school groups go there now, which was just not true.
No.
50 years ago. So I'm wondering, was there a period when we just kind of lost track of that identity?
Yeah.
And then there was this kind of resurgence.
Well, I don't have the entire answer to that question, Jenny, and I think one of the things that really struck me, and I opened the book with actually when I was driving down Broadway with my brother Kevin here in the incredibly bright green shirt in my favorite driving. You can spot him quite easily. And Kevin and I were driving along because I think it was in a book that Eric Sandweiss and some other people had done for the Missouri Historical Society, Where We Live or something like that. There was a discussion of mounds and different neighborhoods. And I somehow or other had read about this mound marker that was at the site of the Big Mound. And Kevin and I were driving along Broadway looking for it. And Broadway in that area is really in bad shape. And the mound marker was in bad shape. It had been vandalized. It was in a weed-ridden circle of granite stones. But it wasn't just the way it had been vandalized that really struck me. And part of what inspired me to continue working on this project is that the mound marker had a placard that talked about how this had been the site of the great mound that had given St. Louis its name and that had been raised about 1870. This mound marker was put there by a heritage group, the Colonial Danes, in 1929. The mound was not raised about 1870. You could look at the Post-Dispatch and see it was raised over the course of the fall of 1868, and its last bit was raised in April of 1869. Not very difficult to find an exact date. And it wasn't known as the Great Mound. It was called the Big Mound. Even in German, which was helpful to me, because you could look in a German newspaper for Der Big Mound and find references to it, right? But what struck me was that this mound marker was placed by a white colonial women's heritage group 60 years after the mound was raised, and it was full of historical inaccuracies, right? So I think in the late 1920s, there's this part of kind of historical pageantry that's going on in the early 20th century. There'd been the pageant and masque in 1914. Heritage groups were trying to work on local history as part of sort of civic boosterism. But I think it was fading from the memory of living people. Two of the people who contributed to the commemorative ceremonies then were two very old men who, as very little boys, had taken out beads from the big mound as it was being leveled. And they ended up at the Missouri History Museum. But in the living memory of non-native St. Louisans, that mound is fading. And those images that are in the book were not in circulation at all. The marker was inaccurate. I don't think there was a lot of continuity in historical memory at that point. And even though there were still at that point tens of thousands of mounds in the state of Missouri. But I think part of what's happened is that since the Osage have been involved in the efforts to repatriate or rematriate Sugarloaf Mound, which started 2008, 2009, when they purchased the house on the top, that Sugarloaf has been more in the news. And then in the last several years, there's been bipartisan legislation that's been working its way through the federal government to try to make a bi-state national historic park. Like Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a state park, but it's not a national historic park. But I didn't know about them either. But, my own ignorance should not be taken to stand in for the fact that Native peoples know of these things, right? This is something that there's a lot of room for more Native voices in this conversation.
Throughout your research, You just mentioned casually that there were 10,000 mounds in Missouri.
28,000.
Okay, all right, I see your credit. So in your research, did you find how far north they went? And I know you're specifically in Missouri, but there are so many mounds cultures in the Midwest.
Yeah, so there's
The one in Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
The one up along the Mississippi River
Right.
in Iowa.
yeah,
The
there,
effigy mounds. I mean,
Yeah.
there's fabulous mounds.
so and there are lots of mounds still in existence today in Missouri and elsewhere, and there are many parks that center around mounds. Although there are still in Ohio golf courses atop mound complexes that recently have had 99-year leases renewed, so people can play golf in and among the sacred sites. In the late 1800s, theories that the mounds were natural formations were still in circulation by those who wanted to deny that they had been built by indigenous peoples of the past. And the Smithsonian Institute, or the Smithsonian Institution under the Bureau of Ethnology, conducted about a decade's worth of research and prepared a report 1890, 1891 that was published in 1894 that was called Mound Explorations. And that report, which was something like 700 pages long, included a map of basically the eastern half of the United States. And every place there's a red dot on it, there was a major mound complex and center. And I have that in there, and the map is all red because they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. And that report, for those who had been deniers in the face of incontrovertible evidence that these were built structures, that kind of put the nail in the coffin on that one. But yes, you're absolutely right. They were all over the place. I was really concentrating just on that group of 27 and Sugarloaf within the city borders itself. Because I was trying to figure out how the growth of the city interacted with the repurposing and destruction of the mounds at the same time that removal was happening.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Oh, sure, sorry. It didn't sound to me like it was actually working, but is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question in the back?
Besides Big Mound and Cahokia and Sugarloaf, which are probably the three that anybody who hasn't looked into it has heard of, is there another specific place or two in St. Louis that you look at entirely differently now because of what you know about the mound history?
Actually, when I was driving in from the airport yesterday, I got off 70 at the Kings Highway, the Union Boulevard Kings Highway exit, and I was driving south on Kings Highway and passed Cote Brillant, right by where the old McBride High School used to be, and there was a mound there. And I thought, and I haven't on this trip wandered around by the art museum, but there were a bunch of mounds right adjacent to where the art museum was, where they were not the same kind. They were not massive, really monumental ones that had buildings on top or were giant burial mounds, but there were a series of other indigenous mounds there, and those were destroyed for the World's Fair. And now when I drive on 55 past Sugarloaf, I mean, I don't know how many times I drove by that mound without knowing that was a mound. Did any of you see the Counter Public installations there? Yeah, and they had they're a group of indigenous artists who call themselves the New Red Order, had done a really amazing billboard, and it's based on this John Egan monumental grandeur of the Mississippi River, which is a panorama. I don't know if you've seen it in the St. Louis Art Museum. And panoramas, it was like, if you can imagine a vertical curtain, like a giant roll of canvas here and another roll over there, and they would just unfold, right? And somebody would talk and you would see the Mississippi River rolling by. Well, there's an Egan image of the opening of a mound, but there are many, many mounds in that painting. And the artists of the New Red Order did sort of a reverse image of one of those with the expression above it, got land, give it back. So kind of hearkening to that Got Milk campaign, if you remember. But it's like, this is sacred land. Sugarloaf is sacred. There's still houses on it that people refuse to sell. I think there's a fraternity house on one of the levels of it.
It's a pharmacy.
Pardon?
It's a fraternity of pharmacists.
A fraternity of pharmacists.
Yeah. They don't respond to anything.
Yeah.
The lady that lives there is about 89 years old, and she was raised there, reared there. And I think she may leave it to the Osage in her will, but I'm not sure about that.
That would be good.
Yeah.
And this, I've never done anything like this, and it sounds like I write books all the time. I've written 3, but my book, at the very last page, if you look at the footnote, it tells you how to donate to the Osage to buy back the rest of Sugarloaf Mound.
Do we have any other questions? We do. We have two more, and that's it. So we're gonna go black shirt, orange shirt.
Sure. As we're all familiar, St. Louis is built over a lot of caves as well.
Yes.
I was wondering if you found anything in your research that suggested the mound builders they likely used a lot of the caves in this area, I imagine.
Yes.
And if any of that history was erased along with or lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not something I personally have found, but I have read. And there is an archaeologist by the name of Susan Alt, who's written about the place of water in indigenous cosmology and about how caves are special kinds of openings to other sacred spaces. And there was one just under the big mound. And what Alt and some others have done is try to map out some of this sort of watery underworld, both here in where the St. Louis complex was, as well as some sites in Illinois. And yes, they certainly were destroyed. And actually, there were a lot of beer gardens in them in the 19th century because it was cool down there. And I think
her last name?
Last question.
Pardon?
What was her last name?
Alt, A-L-T.
Okay. Thank you.
So my question is, how would you get teenagers who are taking a history class, an American history class or a St. Louis history class, to understand the significance of this? Or how would you compare this to something contemporary or a current issue to get them to see the parallels or history repeats itself? And in talking about how we make this relatable to high school kids, since this is St. Louis, I think everybody's dying to know where you went to high school.
I'd like to introduce Maggie Sullivan, the president of Rosada Kane Academy. My alma mater, formerly Rosada Kane High School. And your question's a little bit pointed, Maggie. I guess, one of the things that struck me just within the last couple of years is I did a presentation about mounds and indigenous histories in the United States for a middle school in California. And it combined with a geography lesson that the teacher was doing. The kids were studying states. And one of the things the teacher had them do, and then I started quizzing her, was looking just at the names of states of the United States. And if you look at the Eastern Seaboard, a lot of them have to do with the names of founders or English monarchs, right? Mm-hmm. The Carolinas, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. Not all of it, though. Massachusetts, right? And as you work your way westward across the country and you think about the origin of state names, you begin to wonder why those names are what they were, where they come from, what they mean, what languages they come from. And after I gave this presentation to a bunch of middle schoolers, their teacher had them write me thank you notes. And one of the students said, "Oh, Dr. Cleary, thank you so much for coming to our class." And then she drew a big map of the continental US and she wrote in capital letters, "Native," with an exclamation point. And I thought, good, right?
Yeah.
She got that. I think, one thing I think it's worth doing is just looking at maps, how maps inscribe histories. you see maps often of native peoples that have language groups superimposed over environmental areas, right? That suggesting that it's like natural history, not human civilized history. Or you have state borders in places where they don't need to be. So one thing I do is look at maps. There's also how much are high schoolers willing to read, or would they rather watch video? I would have them. You're here and you read.
Yes.
But would you like to watch a film made by an indigenous filmmaker called Real Injun, INJUN, which is about the history of Hollywood stereotyping and how indigenous people have seen themselves portrayed and how they respond to it? Or watch a recent brilliant sitcom like Reservation Dogs, not Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, but Reservation Dogs, or a great film like Smoke Signals, to get people in, I think in the first place, to get rid of the vanishing Indian myth once and for all, and then to start digging around. I mean, there's really fascinating stuff just even in newspapers that are pretty easily accessible on databases about indigenous history in St. Louis. Beyond that, I don't know, maybe some K through 12 teachers will have some other suggestions for Maggie Sullivan.
I think what we're going to do now is not convene. What's the opposite of convene? No, adjourn. Adjourn. We're going to adjourn. However, I see some of you still have questions. Patty will be around here for a little while. She will be but she'll be happy to give you her autograph if you buy one of her books, I think. Or if
Yeah,
you,
I'm not signing random pieces of paper.
right.
Yeah, we
I
have
want to thank everybody for coming out on this rainy night, and especially thank Patty for sharing.